Dear listeners, I ask you to listen to the story until the very end and be sure to write a review about what you liked and what needs to be changed to make it more interesting for you to listen to my stories. The Last Train from Dresden. I don't know why I remember it so clearly. Maybe it's because war stains the soul in ways you don't notice at first. Maybe because Dresden wasn't a city that deserved to be swallowed by fire. Or maybe, just maybe, because I was there when the last train left. They had told us Dresden was a legitimate target, that was a hub for German war production, a city of railways and industry. But when I arrived on the ground, stepping over the charred remains of homes, watching civilians pull the dead from collapsed buildings, I didn't see factories. I saw ruins. I saw faces streaked with soot, people wandering like ghosts through a nightmare they hadn't yet woken from. My name is Samuel Brown, First Lieutenant, United States Army. Officially, I was there as a scout, gathering intel for our advancing forces. Unofficially, my orders had changed. A handful of us were sent to pull out whatever civilians we could before the Soviets arrived. A rescue mission, or maybe just a way for the higher-ups to feel a little less guilty about what had been done to this place. Either way, I didn't ask questions. I just followed orders. The air smelled of ash and something worse. Flesh. That's the smell that gets into your uniform, into your hair. It stays with you. The city had been bombed for 2 nights straight, wave after wave of incendiaries setting it ablaze, until even the stones seemed to glow with the heat. And yet, somehow people had survived. Thousands of them. Crawling out of basements, huddling in the ruins of what had once been theaters, libraries, homes. I moved through the wreckage, trying not to look at the bodies. You learn to keep your eyes on the living. It's the only way to keep moving. I found a woman holding a child in her arms, rocking him even though he wasn't crying, wasn't even moving. Her eyes met mine, hollow and accusing. Bahnhof, she whispered. The train station. I nodded. That was where we were going. We had secured one train. Just one. An old steam locomotive still intact despite everything. It wasn't much, but it was all we had. If we could get it moving, we could get at least a few hundred people out of the city before the Red Army arrived. But getting to the station was another problem entirely. The streets were filled with the desperate, the dying, the damned. And somewhere in the ruins, German soldiers still clung to their rifles, not yet ready to surrender. The woman followed me, stumbling as she carried the child. Others saw us moving and fell in behind. Soon, I had a crowd trailing after me, silent shadows moving through the ruins of Dresden. And with every step, I wondered if I was leading them towards salvation or a different kind of death. We moved through the ruins like ghosts, our footsteps muffled by the ash and debris that coated the streets. The train station wasn't far, but distance meant nothing in a city that had been turned inside out. Every building was a carcass, every alley a graveyard, and every shadow held the promise of something worse. People kept joining us. An old man with a cane, barely able to walk. A teenage girl, her dress singed at the edges, clutching the hand of a boy no older than 10. A wounded soldier, limping beside a woman who might have been his wife, or just another survivor who didn't want to die alone. None of them spoke. There was nothing to say. Then the first shot rang out. I heard it before I felt it, a sharp crack that shattered the silence. The woman beside me gasped, her body jerking backward. Blood bloomed across her dress, dark and wet. She hit the ground with a thud, the child still in her arms. I hit the dirt before I even realized I was moving, heart pounding as more shots rang out. From where, I couldn't tell. The buildings were riddled with holes, snipers' nests in every direction. Trap? Of course, it was a trap. The crowd scattered, some dropping to the ground, others running blindly into the ruins. I rolled onto my stomach, scanning the wreckage ahead. We were only a few hundred feet from the train station. I could see the iron framework of the platform, twisted but still standing. But between us and safety, there was open ground. And someone was watching. I crawled toward the woman, keeping low. The child in her arms was crying now, a thin, reedy sound that made my stomach turn. She was gone, her eyes wide and empty. But the boy, somehow miraculously, was alive. I pulled him from her arms, shielding him with my body. "Shoo," I whispered, though I knew it was useless. The gunfire had stopped. A warning. Whoever was out there wanted us to know they were watching. I peered over the rubble, searching for movement. And then I saw him. A German soldier, barely more than a kid, crouched in the ruins of a burned-out apartment building. His uniform was dirty, torn at the sleeves. He was alone. His rifle was aimed at the crowd, but his hands were shaking. He wasn't a killer. Not yet. I had a choice. I could take the shot, end the threat, or I could risk everything and try to get these people to the train. I took a breath, feeling the weight of the child in my arms. Then slowly I stood up. The boy clung to me, silent now, his tiny fingers digging into my jacket. I raised one hand, open palm. No weapon. No threat. The German kid stiffened, his rifle wavering. Behind me, the survivors watched, waiting. The soldier hesitated. And then, just as slowly, he lowered his weapon. I didn't know if it was mercy or exhaustion, or just the madness of war. But in that moment, it didn't matter. I turned, gripping the boy tightly, and started walking toward the train station. The others followed. And the soldier? He just stood there, watching us go. The train station loomed ahead, its skeletal remains casting long shadows in the dim light of a dying afternoon. What had once been a place of departures and reunions was now a shell of twisted iron and shattered glass. The clock tower stood frozen in time, its hands locked at the moment the bombs had fallen, as if the city itself had given up on the idea of moving forward. The air smelled of burned wood and something worse, something I didn't want to name, and every step toward that station felt like walking through the remains of a world that had already ended. The crowd behind me had grown, a procession of the desperate, the starving, the barely alive. They clung to each other, eyes darting at every sudden sound, waiting for the next explosion, the next burst of gunfire that would erase whatever fragile hope they still carried. I could feel their fear pressing against my back, but I kept walking, one foot in front of the other, gripping the child in my arms as if he were the only real thing left in this ruined city. When we reached the platform, the train was still there, a miracle in itself. A steam locomotive, blackened by soot but intact, its rusted exterior giving it the look of something pulled from another time, another war. It wasn't much, just a few passenger cars and a freight carriage, but it was enough. Enough to get these people out before the Soviets arrived, before the city was swallowed up in another kind of hell. The problem was we had no conductor. I climbed onto the platform, scanning the train, my mind racing. If there was no one to drive it, then all of this had been for nothing. The people behind me, what was left of them, had followed me here on nothing but faith, and now I was standing on the edge of breaking it. Then, from inside the locomotive, there was movement. A figure emerged, his clothes stained with oil, his face streaked with ash. He was old, his shoulders hunched, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the crowd with something between suspicion and recognition. "Are you the conductor?" I asked, my voice raw. He wiped his hands on a rag, nodding slowly. "Was." I took a breath, stepping forward. "We need to go. Now." The old man exhaled through his nose, looking at the people behind me. He saw what I saw. Mothers holding on to their children as if letting go meant losing them forever. The wounded barely able to stand. The ones who had stopped crying because they had no more tears left. "Cole's low," he muttered, shaking his head. "She might make 20 miles before she dies." 20 miles is better than here," I said. For a moment, I thought he was going to refuse, that he would turn his back and leave us standing there, lost in the ruins of a city that had already decided we didn't matter. But then he nodded, climbing back into the locomotive without another word. I turned to the crowd, motioning them forward. "Get in. Quickly." They didn't hesitate. They flooded onto the train, pushing past each other in a silent frenzy, their bodies pressing into the cramped space of the passenger cars. There was no room for comfort, no room for anything but survival. The wounded were carried inside, the children lifted through the windows, and soon the cars were filled with the sound of labored breathing, of whispered prayers in languages I didn't understand. I moved through the train, counting heads, trying to convince myself we had done enough. But as I reached the last car, I saw her. She stood at the edge of the platform, wrapped in a coat that was too large for her thin frame, her hands gripping the railing as if letting go meant falling into something worse than fire. She wasn't old, no older than 20, but her face was lined with something beyond her years. When our eyes met, she didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me as if I were the ghost and she was the one still alive. "We're leaving," I said, though I knew she already understood. For a long moment, she didn't respond. Then slowly she turned her head, looking past me, past the train, back toward the city. "They're coming," she whispered. I followed her gaze, my stomach twisting. In the distance, beyond the ruins, beyond the hollowed-out buildings and the burning wreckage, they were there. The Soviets. And they weren't stopping. The sight of them sent a cold weight sinking into my chest. At first, they were just shadows moving through the ruins, dark figures weaving between the skeletal remains of buildings, their shapes barely visible in the swirling dust and smoke. But then, as they drew closer, details emerged. The gleam of bayonets, catching the last scraps of daylight. The way they moved, deliberate, methodical, spreading out as they advanced. A tide that would sweep over what remained of Dresden and leave nothing untouched. The girl at the edge of the platform still hadn't moved. I could see her hands gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles had gone white, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She was afraid, but not in the way the others were. The people packed into the train feared dying in the ruins, feared the hunger, the cold, the fire. But her fear was something different, something deeper. She had seen what the Soviets did to the cities they took, to the people they found in them. Maybe she had seen it before, in another place, another time. Or maybe she had just heard the stories, and sometimes the stories were enough. "We have to go," I said again, forcing steel into my voice. Still, she hesitated. The first shots cracked through the air, distant but unmistakable, and whatever was holding her in place finally broke. She moved, stepping forward with sudden urgency, grabbing onto the railing of the nearest carriage as I reached for her arm, pulling her up. She stumbled inside just as the train gave a deep, shuddering groan, the engine coughing like an old man waking from a bad dream. The smell of steam and burning coal filled the air as the wheels jerked forward an inch, then another, grinding against the tracks with painful resistance. I turned back toward the platform, scanning for any stragglers, but there was no one left. Only the dead and the city that had swallowed them. Then the train lurched again, and the platform began to slide away beneath my feet. I climbed onto the last carriage, pulling myself inside just as we picked up speed. The girl was standing in the corner, arms wrapped tightly around herself, her face turned toward the window as the ruins of Dresden blurred past. I followed her gaze, watching as the city fell away behind us, the twisted metal and crumbling stone, the skeletons of buildings still standing like gravestones. And behind it all, the advancing wave of Soviet soldiers, spilling into the wreckage like floodwater, unstoppable, inevitable. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the rattling of the train, the steady, rhythmic clatter of steel wheels against broken tracks. The people in the car sat huddled together, pressed against each other in tight knots of exhaustion and fear. A child whimpered somewhere in the dark, his voice muffled by the heavy weight of silence. The girl turned from the window, her eyes finding mine in the dim light. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost lost beneath the noise of the train. I didn't answer right away, because the truth was, I didn't know. The tracks stretched out ahead of us, disappearing into a darkness that held no promises, no guarantees. The conductor had said we'd make it 20 miles, maybe less. After that, it was anyone's guess. "Away from here," I finally said, because that was the only answer I had. She didn't look satisfied, but she didn't press me for more. Instead, she turned back toward the window, watching the city vanish into the distance, until there was nothing left but smoke and memory. I sat down on the cold metal floor, leaning my head back against the wall, feeling the vibration of the train humming through my bones. We were still alive. For now, that was enough. Outside, the night swallowed Dresden whole, and the last train kept moving. The further we traveled, the quieter the train became. As we passed through the darkened countryside, the sound of the wheels on the tracks was the only thing left that connected us to the world we just left behind. The train had picked up speed, but the city was already out of reach, swallowed by the shadows and the smoke. It felt like we were leaving more than just a place behind. We were leaving a part of ourselves. The kind of part that didn't return, no matter how far you ran. The kind of part that had been burned away with the rest of Dresden, scattered among the ruins. People began to fall into uneasy slumber, their bodies collapsing against the hard metal seats, their faces pale from exhaustion, their minds clouded by whatever horrors they'd just witnessed. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Instead, I sat in the cold gloom of the train car, my back against the wall, listening to the soft murmur of the survivors around me, the occasional cough or rustle of clothing. Every now and then, a sharp intake of breath would cut through the stillness. someone waking from a nightmare only to fall back into another. I thought of the soldier we passed earlier, the one who had lowered his rifle when I stood up. I couldn't forget his face, the look of disbelief, of hesitation. I knew what it was like to hesitate in war. I knew how it felt to be trapped between the necessity of duty and the horror of what you were ordered to do. It was a feeling I had carried with me through every battle, every village I'd crossed, every town that had been reduced to rubble in the name of something bigger, something more important than the lives of the people who lived there. I've been a soldier long enough to know that sometimes survival came at the expense of everything else. But I'd also seen the other side, the side where survival wasn't enough to erase the cost. It was cold in the train, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and doesn't leave. The heating system was ancient, and the air smelled faintly of mold and burnt oil, but it was better than being in the open. The soldiers in the car were silent, their eyes flickering nervously toward the windows as the landscape slid past. I could tell they were waiting for something. Maybe the sound of planes overhead, maybe the whine of distant artillery. The war had never really ended for them. It had just moved on, taken on new forms, new faces. A few hours into the night, the train slowed. A creaking groan echoed through the cars as the engine sputtered, its movements growing more labored. We were running low on coal. The old man had warned me, but the urgency of getting out had pushed me to ignore his words. Now the reality was settling in. We had reached the point where we were no longer fleeing the city. We were fleeing time itself, fleeing the inevitability of what would come next. The Soviet army was still out there, and as much as we wanted to escape, the world didn't work that way. The train came to a halt, the screech of the wheels against the rails splitting the silence like a knife. I stood up, moving quickly through the car, my boots thumping softly against the floor as I made my way toward the front. The old man was sitting by the controls, wiping his hands on his rag again, his face drawn and tired. "We're out of coal," he said flatly, as if he had known this would happen. I looked out the window, trying to judge our surroundings. We were deep in the countryside now, nothing but rolling hills and dark forests stretching out on either side. There was no sign of life, no lights, no signs of civilization. The Soviet forces were still far behind us, but that didn't mean we were safe. We were alone here, in the dark, with nothing but our own desperation to keep us going. "How much farther?" I asked. The old man shrugged, his eyes fixed on the tracks ahead. "Not far enough." The words hit me like a punch in the stomach. "We'll have to walk from here," he added, his voice almost a whisper. I turned back to the car, scanning the faces of the people huddled inside. They were still asleep, for the most part, or too weak to move. We had to make a decision, and fast. The Soviets were coming, and the longer we stayed here, the more dangerous it would be. If we didn't move, we'd be sitting ducks. I made my way back to the rear of the train, where the girl was sitting with the child. She was awake now, her eyes fixed on me as I approached. "We need to go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The train's out of coal." Her expression didn't change. She had already known. She'd been waiting for something to break, waiting for the moment when the reality of it all would catch up to us. "I know," she said softly, "but where will we go?" I didn't have an answer for her. There was no place safe, no sanctuary beyond the ruins we just left. The world had already turned its back on us. But we had to keep moving. We had no choice. "We walk," I said. "We head east. There's a town about 20 miles from here. Maybe we can find something there." "Place to hide." She nodded, standing up, gathering the child in her arms once again. She didn't say anything more, just followed me toward the door. The rest of the passengers were waking now, murmuring among themselves, faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. "Gather your things," I said. "We're leaving the train." It was strange how quickly people adapted to the idea. There were no protests, no cries of disbelief, just a quiet acceptance. They knew we were out of options. We stepped off the train into the cold, still night, the air thick with the scent of earth and iron. I turned east, toward the distant hills, the faint outline of a town I could only hope existed. And we began to walk. The first few steps were slow, tentative. The train was already a fading memory behind us, the sound of its creaking frame swallowed by the night, as though it had never existed. It felt like walking through a dream, where nothing was quite real, and the weight of what we were doing hadn't yet fully settled. The ground was uneven underfoot, rocky and damp from the night air, and the cold seemed to be getting worse with every step. But we couldn't afford to stop. We couldn't afford to think about the cold, the hunger, or the aching fatigue that was beginning to settle in our bones. The girl walked beside me, her face pale but resolute, the child held tightly in her arms. I could hear his faint cries every now and then, muffled against her chest, but she didn't falter, didn't slow down. She just kept walking, her eyes fixed ahead, as though the act of moving forward was the only thing that mattered. Behind us, the rest of the survivors followed, a ragged line of broken people with nowhere left to go but forward. There were a few who stumbled, who had to be helped along, but the pace never slowed for long. Fear and instinct had a way of pushing people past their limits, and we were all driven by that same desperate need to survive. Hours passed, or maybe it was days, it was hard to tell in the darkness. The hills rose and fell, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer with every passing minute. The night was so thick and heavy that it felt like we were walking through a fog that clung to everything, thickening the air in our lungs, slowing our progress. The cold cut deeper now, biting through our thin clothing, and I could hear the occasional cough or shiver from the people behind me. Every now and then, I would glance over at the girl. She hadn't spoken since we left the train, but I could see the strain in her face. The child in her arms was silent now, perhaps from exhaustion or the overwhelming fear that hung in the air, but his presence was a constant reminder of what we were fighting for. Survival wasn't just about us anymore, it was about him too. We had no idea what lay ahead. The town we were hoping to reach could be a ruin, or it could be filled with soldiers or worse, more Soviets. But there was no turning back. Not now. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, casting pale streaks of light across the barren landscape, we reached the crest of a hill. The town was there, barely visible in the distance, a thin silhouette against the pale sky. It wasn't much, just a collection of buildings huddled together like forgotten memories. But it was a sign of life, of something that still existed beyond the destruction. We made our way down the hill, the weight of the journey pressing down on us with every step. But as we got closer, the first signs of trouble began to emerge. The town wasn't empty. It wasn't abandoned either. There were figures moving in and out of the buildings, some in military uniforms, others in civilian clothes. We were too far away to make out details, but it was clear that something was off. This wasn't a peaceful village waiting to offer refuge. The air here was thick with tension, a quiet hum of activity that felt wrong. I stopped, holding up a hand to signal the others. "We need to be careful," I whispered, my voice hoarse from hours of walking. "This place doesn't feel right." The girl nodded, her expression hardening. The child in her arms stirred, his eyes blinking awake as the sound of the town reached us. We moved off the path, slipping into the cover of the trees, trying to stay out of sight as we watched the town below. The figures in the town were moving in patterns, too organized to be simple civilians. There was something almost military about the way they walked, the way they clustered in groups near certain buildings, as though they were waiting for something. And then I saw it. A truck pulled into the main square, its headlights cutting through the haze of morning light. The truck was full of soldiers, Soviet soldiers. Their faces were grim, and as they disembarked, they formed a tight, disciplined line, their rifles slung over their shoulders. I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. "Damn it," I muttered under my breath. "We're too late." The girl beside me stiffened, her eyes wide with fear as she caught sight of the soldiers. She stepped back instinctively, her hand tightening around the child. "Should we go around?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I shook my head. There was no way we could outrun them now. They'd seen us. They would see us no matter which way we went. Our only chance was to make it past the town, out of their line of sight. We couldn't stop here, not with them so close. "We need to move," I said more urgently this time. "We can't stay here." We turned and began moving in the opposite direction, trying to circle around the town, hoping to keep our distance from soldiers. But with every step, the sense of danger grew. The air was thick with the sound of our own breathing, and every snap of a twig beneath our feet felt like a gunshot. Just as we were about to reach the edge of the trees, I heard the unmistakable sound of boots crunching through the underbrush behind us. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. We weren't alone anymore. I turned slowly, my hand instinctively reaching for the rifle slung across my back, but I stopped myself before I drew it. No, not yet. Not unless it was absolutely necessary. We weren't soldiers now. We were survivors. I motioned for the others to stay down, my eyes scanning the dense trees around us, trying to pick out the source of the sound. My heart pounded in my chest as the rustling grew louder, closer. And then, just as I was about to take a step back into the deeper cover of the woods, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, disheveled, his face haggard with exhaustion, wearing a tattered coat. At first, I thought it was another soldier, but there was no uniform, no weapon in his hands, just a man as lost as the rest of us. He staggered toward us, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and desperation, and then his gaze locked on me. He didn't say anything at first. He just stopped a few feet away, breathing heavily, as if he had been running for miles. We need help," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "The soldiers are here. They're taking people." I narrowed my eyes, my instincts on high alert. I had seen enough to know that soldiers weren't always what they seemed, and desperation could cloud a man's judgment. But there was something in his eyes, something that told me he wasn't lying. "Who were they taking?" I asked, my voice low but firm. "The women and children," the man said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "And anyone else who looks weak. They've been rounding them up since dawn. If they see you, if they see anyone, you won't make it out of here." I exchanged a quick glance with the girl, and for a moment, we both stood frozen in the silence that followed. The weight of his words hung heavy between us, suffocating the air. Every instinct in me screamed that we had to keep moving, that there was no time to waste, but another part of me knew we couldn't just leave without trying to help. "Where are they taking them?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. "To the trucks," the man said, his eyes darting nervously toward the town. "They're gathering them up, getting them ready to send. Somewhere. I don't know where. I only saw them drag a woman and child past me. They didn't even care. They just, his voice cracked and he faltered, as if he couldn't bring himself to finish the thought. I was torn. Every part of me wanted to flee, to keep running and never look back. But I knew that if we didn't act now, if we didn't try to do something, we'd be just as complicit in this madness as the soldiers who were rounding people up. We had to make a choice. And as much as I hated it, I knew what that choice had to be. "We'll try to help them," I said, glancing back at the others. "Stay low, stay quiet, and follow me." The man's eyes widened in disbelief, but he didn't argue. He simply nodded and fell in behind us, his footsteps barely a sound on the ground. The girl and the child stayed close, their faces pale and frightened, but they didn't hesitate. We had no choice. We moved quickly, crouching low, weaving between the trees and keeping the town in our sights. The soldiers were still in the square, patrolling, unaware of our presence, or so we hoped. The town's buildings loomed ahead, casting long shadows in the growing light of dawn, and I could hear the faint sounds of shouting in the distance. We had to act fast. We approached the town's edge cautiously, sticking to the trees and trying to stay out of view. The girl was breathing heavily now, her eyes scanning the streets nervously. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she gripped the child tighter with each passing step. She was afraid, but I could see the determination beneath it. We all were afraid, but there was something stronger than fear that kept us going. Hope. The kind of hope that comes from knowing you can still make a difference, even in the smallest of ways. Then we reached the edge of the first building, and I motioned for everyone to stop. I peeked around the corner and saw the soldiers again, 3 of them standing near the trucks, barking orders to a group of civilians. The women and children were lined up, some looking dazed, others crying, all of them with fear etched across their faces. I turned to the others. "We need to get closer. Stay behind me and don't make a sound." We moved slowly, carefully, like shadows, slipping through the cracks in the walls and staying low to the ground. I could feel the adrenaline pumping in my veins, my heart racing, but I kept my focus. The moment we broke cover, the moment we were spotted, there would be no turning back. As we got closer, I saw a woman, her arms outstretched, desperately trying to reach for her child, who had been torn from her arms by a soldier. The sight of it made my blood run cold. The child was crying, reaching back toward her, but the soldier just shoved him into the back of the truck like he was nothing. My hand tightened around the rifle. This wasn't happening. Not here. Not now. I motioned for the others to hold position, then stepped forward, out of the cover. I couldn't stay hidden anymore. I had to do something. "Hey," I shouted, my voice ringing through the air. "You." The soldiers froze. They turned, their eyes narrowing as they took in the sight of me standing there, rifle in hand. There was a tense moment of silence. Then one of the soldiers raised his weapon. "Move back," he shouted. But I didn't move. Instead, I raised my rifle, steadying my aim. The sound of a gunshot echoed across the town as I fired a warning shot into the air. "Let them go," I yelled. "Now." The soldiers hesitated. In that split second, I saw the fear in their eyes, the same fear I had seen in countless men before. The fear of someone who knows they might be caught in a moment they can't control. The hesitation lasted only for a heartbeat, but it was enough. The woman's child was freed. She ran to him, and without another word, they disappeared into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as we had appeared. But the soldiers didn't let us go so easily. I could hear them shouting, but we didn't stay to listen. We ran, darting into the woods and heading back toward the hills, the sound of boots pounding the ground behind us. We didn't stop. We couldn't. We didn't look back. And as the distant gunfire faded into the horizon, I knew one thing for certain: we were not going to stop fighting. Not now. Not ever. We kept moving, always forward. Always running, always surviving. Because that was all we had left. The last train had long since passed. Now all that was left was the road ahead.